Hey, friends, we were privileged to have Dr. Mike Israetel, who's a fitness guru and an evidence-based fitness influencer on our podcast. I wanted you to be able to hear the whole interview because it was wide-ranging. We started out talking about how to talk about science and evidence, and you'll see that it got us to a far bigger conversation about the zeitgeist, about how we communicate generally, and about the conversations that folks ought to have in good faith about issues that can be really controversial. We wanted to air the whole thing here, so I hope that you'll take a listen. And what you're going to hear is two people having a conversation in good faith about issues that they disagree on. And I think we have to have more of those conversations rather than less. So take a listen, and I hope that you enjoy a really good, deep conversation between two people who agree on some things and disagree on others. Take a listen. All right, can you introduce yourself for the tape?
Yeah, my name is Mike Israetel, and I have a PhD in sport physiology, and I help to run RP Strength, the company, and the YouTube channel, and all that other good stuff.
Very good. We really appreciate you joining today. We want to have a conversation about the online origins of this MAHA movement that is shaping so much of our public health infrastructure now through RFK Jr. And I can think of nobody better to have that conversation with. You're sort of one of the heroes of the I'll say the bro fitness space. And even before I knew who you were like pervading my Instagram reels, started to watch your stuff and really enjoyed it. And as a scientist who also, admittedly not as intensely as you enjoys the fitness space, I really appreciated getting your videos. And my father, who's a PhD engineer, like literally loves your stuff. So I'm grateful to share the conversation.
It's great to be on, man. Thank you so much.
So walk us through, how do you think about, like, as you're putting together content, how do you think about who your target audience is and where they're coming to your content from?
We think about who they are mostly by doing a combination of two things. One is to look at our analytics for YouTube, for example, which tells us a lot about who they are. It tells us gender breakdowns. It tells us extensively what their other interests are on YouTube, which can tell you a lot about someone. And then the other way we do it is to intellectualize, to draw some generalizations and inferences beyond the data that we have perceived, to try to reason through the world and figure out, okay, so here are the people we're talking to, here are the total number of people that exist. What waypoint can we pick between those two in order to expand our reach, while at the same time still providing people like an intersection of quality content that is still in a place where I can add some marginal value that makes sense? Because like we could do all kinds of crazy TikTok dance videos. I'm no good at that, so that wouldn't work. And we can sell out and do kind of crowd pleaser videos that violate the like scientific understanding of the world, and that wouldn't work. So anything that is like logically in my best estimate is correct, and also I think people find informative, entertaining, some combination of that, I think that's who we look at to be our target demographics. It's very broad, but we do have the data on who our target demographic already is, although it's growing and changing. And so we do have some understanding of who we're speaking to at any given time.
That's helpful to understand. And you come at this, you are as evidence-based as it gets in this space, which I deeply value. And oftentimes, unfortunately, this is a space that's not known for, we'll just say it's adherence to scientific evidence. And so I see you a lot of times in your content, both trying to offer evidence-based advice and also do this thing of educating people about how to think about science in the process. How purposive are you in trying to do that? I mean, how much does that shape your thinking about trying to give people some, to put it crudely, like a bullshit meter about how to think about what they're hearing in all the other videos that they're getting served when they get served yours?
Yeah, quite a bit. So science for us operates in two ways. One is a filter. We only say things that make reasonable sense scientifically, because they're more likely to be correct, and having correct advice, no matter where it came from, is a really good thing. The other one is as a toolbox that we slowly over time, mostly through kind of implicit skill sets, but also through explicit articulations of you need to think like this, in order to think more clearly, we end up sort of helping, especially long-term audience folks, build up their kind of baloney detector a little bit more, their scientific worldview a little bit more, so that instead of just consuming some decent info from us on the channel, they can go and see another fitness claim or a claim in something even just related to fitness, like health or longevity, and look at it and parse it through a scientific lens that they've built in many ways, but hopefully in some small part with our help, and then be more likely to make correct decisions and less likely to make incorrect decisions. So one place what we like people to be is a great place is that middle of the road where you're not so sure you want to say this thing is wrong, but you're not like, oh, this thing is for sure right. The for sure right stuff will come along one way or another at some point, but getting onto things that are for sure wrong is like a super, super bad idea. And so even if we can get people to be like, well, this stuff that this person's saying might be true, but it sure hits enough of the warning signs on my kind of scientific thinking ometer that I'm just going to put this aside for now and not invest heavily into the idea that this could be true. And I think even that is a huge win in of itself.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that because that's the thing about science is that usually it doesn't have big exclamation points on the claims it makes. It usually offers you this is the best available evidence that we have right now. This could change based on new available evidence. And it seems to me that the space is dominated by people who make claims that go something like this. If you're not doing X, Y, and Z, you're leaving huge gains on the table, and so you're failing at fitness. And those claims tend to do really well. And I don't know if it's a matter of like the psychology of the kinds of folks who tend to be involved in the space. I don't know if it's the incentives of the algorithm that feeds that. I think it's probably some emergent combination of the two of them.
I can tell you right now, there's no algorithm other than a thing that tries to get to answer only one question. What do you, the viewer, want to see the most? That is the entire purpose of the algorithm, and it is a limit function that ends at giving you exactly what you want when you want it right in front of your eyes. It is completely objective. And so there is absolutely no agenda with the algorithm. Everything you see on YouTube and its trends are to just give people more of what they want. So your first question really says it all. Your first hypothesis is everything.
Yeah. So what is it about all of us who want a firm answer? And because that's the thing about it, is like inevitably there's some new thing that surfaces, right? Like I think that the issue of the day is sauna. I saw your quick short on sauna, right?
Yeah.
And there are people who literally are out there saying that like if you're not doing sauna, you are going to die a shorter, less, and you're going to live a less happy life before you do it.
Yeah.
And people with credentials, right? And that's the hard part. Like people who have legitimate scientific credentials saying this stuff. And what happens is you end up having that, and then you end up having this sort of backlash community, right? That always comes up. And then you end up having these like two positions. And I guess what is it maybe about the psychology that leaves us wanting a level of certainty around this thing? That like we want to know that we side on one side of what is ultimately like not that important a debate, all said.
Sure.
I mean, how do you think about that? Like in your sense of being a very successful creator in the space, like why do you think that that's so pervasive here?
I think the human desire for certainty is at its core completely logical and predictable. Uncertainty is objectively worse than certainty if you have a choice. And so certainty always looks better because it is a much more high probability assessment of what to do. And so certainty is a thing like well-fitting clothes, properly controlled air in your home, and good food. Everyone's for it. And so it's really easy for people to come in and say, I have certainty for you. The real question is, do they have certainty? And the answer is usually not. But people still click on videos that are very certain because they want certainty. And sometimes they get it. Sometimes they get a little bit of it. Sometimes they get none of it at all. And then somewhere between it being clickbait and it being presented as certainty, even in good faith, but actually being substantially uncertain, is where the rest of that kind of variation lies. But people always want certainty anyway, and it's a good thing that they want certainty. The bad thing is that what is presented to them as certainty isn't always nearly as certain as the people presenting would like them to believe. And that's always going to come down to the filtering system, predominantly of the person clicking on videos. Some number of videos you can click on and get burned enough to where you just don't believe thumbnails and titles anymore. Or you realize some content creators make much more believable thumbnails and titles than other people. So when you see someone else's, you're like, this is probably dog shit because they lie all the time. And then you see someone else's, you're like, it was 9 times out of 10, this guy, when he's certain about something, it really is a lot of evidence for it. And so you just end up choosing people that you like. That doesn't mean everyone's good at making that selection. And there are way more factors other than the veracity of claims addressed that require you to select a fitness influencer. A lot of times it's vibe and comedy and what they look like and 50 other factors, but that sure is one of them. And over time, there has definitely been a trend in the fitness space, as far as I've seen it, where at least clickbait thumbnails, like you're going to see this in this video, but then you don't. They have run their course. They're very, very tough to sell, which is great because enough people on YouTube have been like, I don't follow this person anymore because nothing they ever say makes any goddamn sense. The thumbnails always BS. So over time, it is changing slowly, but it is changing.
I think the other pervasive, uh, I want to call it a zeitgeist that you tend to have is they don't want you to know X. So
Sure.
that, it's the certainty about a thing that is new and novel that tends to counterpose, right, traditional science, or at least the scientific establishment, right?
Sure.
And what tends to perform really well in a lot of these spaces is when you're certain about that one thing that they don't want you to know. Who's they? I don't know. Like, why don't they want you to know it? I really don't know either. But
You
like,
got to click.
it's
Right.
right, right. It's like, and so they've got this like hidden gem of something. Over time, what tends to happen is you get enough of that content and it tends to undermine belief in them, right? Whoever them is. And that
Yeah.
tends to be evidence-based science.
Yeah.
In your thinking, right? You've been really successful as someone who hews very closely to the evidence-based science, and you're honest about this kind of situations. You're like, well, if you like doing this workout, you can do it. Like, that's fine. There's nobody's
Yeah.
going to tell you not to. It just may not be as effective as this other one here.
Yeah.
How do you deal with a lot of that attempted to undermine evidence-based thinking, as if there is really just this cabal, this conspiracy of people who just don't want you to get big enough traps? Like,
Yeah.
I can't make sense of it, but like, maybe you could help me here.
Listen, Abdul, I'm going to assume from your name that you're not Jewish. And so you're clearly just not in the anti big trap cabal, which pays me lots of money regularly, sir, to keep people's traps small. Anyway, that's all in the fine print. I get the emails every week. Um, to us at our RP Strength YouTube, a lot of videos like that are actually a gold mine because if the zeitgeist is this thing that people used to tell you is right is now wrong, and that's incorrect. It turns out the experts were right all along, and the new thing is a wild exaggeration or just wrong. We love that shit because we'll make a video of being like the experts were right, and that is now because there's so many videos of they lied to you. When you say something like the experts are right, you're wrong, that blows up the internet. It's awesome because people are like, "Whoa, that's different." And so to us at RP, it doesn't really much matter how people present this one way or another. Now, for the general consumption of the public and assuming that the folks who consume social media health advice, we have like some interest in them getting marginally better advice than worse advice. There is a whole landscape I could chat about why some people prefer headlines like that and why they have a mistrust of expertise. That is a topic near and dear to my heart. But I'll say like the easiest explanatory factor requires zero invocation of politics. As soon as I tell you, you're going to be like, of course, that it just hits right. It just hits right. There's no depth to it at all. Like, to make a really absurd analogy here, it's like you're with, a girl you've been seeing a few times and it's nothing serious yet, but stuff's happening. And like super, super hot girl walks by and you like stare and you come back and she catches you. She's like, so what's that? You're like, no, it's just a really hot girl. That doesn't make her special in the least. It's just human biology. It's just, heads just do this. That's what they do. Don't overinvest into it. It's just a true fact. Like, I don't know her. She's probably awful. I don't ever want to see her again. But the same thing with like thumbnails and titles that are like the thing you thought is a dependable base of knowledge you take to work every day. Wrong. And people just love that because they're, whoa, I don't want to be wrong. And it's exciting. And that's really like, for most people, that's really the only reason. Now, there is a subsector of people who overlap with that sector who actually have like a little bit of a mistrust of expertise and a belief in the they. And those people definitely are hook, line, and sinker for all that stuff. They're a much smaller community than the overall, like just curious dude who's like, wow, people are wrong about this. I want to know. That's like 80% of it. But there's a 20% where it's like, yeah, there's a very, very distinct, especially in the Maha circles, a kind of a backlash away from expertise. That's its own very interesting curiosity.
And my worry is that over time, the that sort of penchant that we all have built in our minds to not want to miss out on that one tidbit of information, not want to be wrong. I feel like if you get fed videos over and over and over on that, what tends to happen is it starts to create a worldview in which you start to think, well, the experts are always wrong. And the worry I have is that you step back and you take a 30,000 foot view. We've had this rise of an anti-science movement, a lot of it seeded on the internet, a lot of it seeded in a lot of these algorithms that you and I live on. And the worry that I have is that now you actually have a guy who is the Secretary of Health and Human Services who comes out of that space, who's in a position to make a lot of really important decisions when it comes to our public health policies. They're, taking fluoride out of the water. They're, second guessing the value of measles vaccines. And I want to ask you, what does it look like to try and push back on that? Like, as you and I are both kind of, by virtue of having done doctorates in this stuff, members of the They Club, right? Like, what are the kinds of things that we ought to be doing to be able to push back on what is this emergent tendency over time as a function of a lot of this conversation that's been driven?
Yeah. From our perspective on the RP channel, what we want to do is attend to two things at the same time. One is that experts are very fallible and have been wrong. Numerically often, statistically rarely, but there's a lot of stuff experts say, so you're going to have dozens and dozens of things experts are totally wrong about, even though there's thousands and thousands they were just completely correct about. We have to recognize that experts have a fallibility, so their word cannot be used with some kind of deified authority. Like, they're just like, you can't, the experts say, So you have to have a justification for expertise, a room that they could be wrong, and a very fruitful conversation among all parties. At the same time, we have to assert, because it's logically true, at RP, that experts tend to be correct a lot, and so expertise carries a lot of weight. Joe off the street and then Mr. Expert in academia both have every single identical civil right to express any opinion they want. But in the expert area that we're discussing, assuming the academic is an expert area, the probability at face value that the academic is correct versus Joe off the street is like 2 orders of magnitude higher. And so if you are a curious person who wants to improve their fitness or just learn more about the world, you're going to want to listen to a lot of experts. And you're going to want to listen to the occasional video of the experts who are wrong. But that video is probably better presented by somebody like Menno Henselmans, who is an expert and an iconoclast, rather than who someone's not an expert at all, isn't an iconoclast. Because it's always fun when some sort of, Maha pilled pseudo right-wing manosphere podcaster guy who's out of shape says, well, the experts are wrong about this health thing. It's like, and you would know about this how exactly? And obviously this person absolutely could know about it and has a high probability of being correct too, and should be speaking truth to power. But the at face value probability he's correct versus the experts is low. And we try to communicate that RP, like, look, you're going to make your own choice. God bless you. We're going to tell you what the expert consensus looks like. We're going to tell you about some interesting stuff where the experts could be wrong about, and then you're going to make your own decision. 9 times out of 10, you just go, yeah, look, the experts have this figured out. 1 time out of 10, you're like, now this is interesting. And 1 time out of that fraction, so 1/10 of the time, 1 out of 100 times, the experts will be wrong, and thank God somebody spoke up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I really value that perspective, that point that you made about numerically often, but statistically rarely. I think that's where we tend to get in trouble, right? Because there's a lot of grist for people to point to and say, here's why you're wrong. And you're like, yes, that is true. And there are a number of points at which you're wrong. The interesting point that you make, and that, we sort of started this conversation on, which is that science may not be right today, but the thing about it is it's self-correcting, like by its nature. That's like what science does, is that if you have an alternative hypothesis to what the quote unquote experts say, then that hypothesis will be rigorously tested. And if it's proven to be better than what was the alternative, or at least the null, then we will accept that hypothesis, and that becomes what the experts say. And what's interesting about it is that, it's like there is a fallacy at the heart of all of this. And, when I talk to other scientists about communicating science, the point that I always try to remind them is that to most people, the model that they have for expertise is like a priest interpreting the Bible. The Bible never changes. The priest has a different take, and you are an expert because you've read the Bible many, 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 many times. And so that's just that. Versus as scientists, we don't think of ourselves as priests interpreting the Bible. We think of ourselves as generally curious askers of questions to which we use a very rigorous process to answer. and then update our thinking from there, right? But
Yeah.
the hard part is this, is that you have this right, which is to say, you acknowledge the possibility for things to be wrong. But too often, scientists, particularly scientists in government positions like I used to occupy, particularly scientists who have some imprimatur and are making public guidance, too often the guidance that we give them is you need to speak with confidence because there's so much confidence on the other side. And you create what is ultimately this paradox of how should you communicate like a level of certainty in the process, not necessarily in the possibility of the outcome. And you do this really well. And what would your guidance be to, like, you know, Joe Schmo health commissioner out in you name the city who's trying to explain to people why taking a measles vaccine right now makes a lot of sense?
Yeah, totally. It's really easy. You just have to say probably about two things. One is, nothing is certain, and you can really play with people because if they say there are certain things, you can always inject skepticism and make them realize it's not certain whatsoever. And then you say, but this is very much our best guess. It is very likely to be true. And as soon as you say those two things, anything you say afterwards has to follow those two things. And then anyone who critiques you for that being wrong, be like, yep, remember when I said I wasn't certain? Okay. Remember when I said I was probably right? Well, here's my record on the last 100 science things I said. I was wrong on 2 of them. I was right on 98. So unless you have someone better than 98% correct, which is an A plus on every test at school, feel free to continue to follow my advice. And so some people who really don't trust experts kind of on a vengeful or ideological basis, a lot of times they'll try to put it, to where the experts have been wrong a lot. And then I think it's up to experts and consensuses and various bodies of government to go like, we have a track record. So for example, something I don't see very often is a industrial size hammer for a pin nail approach of vaccine efficacy. I think the number of media that can be made by people interviewing virologists and toxicologists and them themselves making media that says vaccines are like one of the greatest things we've ever invented, and the benefit to harm ratio on average is in the 1,000 to 1 to a million to 1 trade-off ROI. We have almost no other biological thing, including healthy eating, and any other activity you could ever measure that most of these don't even come close to the vaccine trade-off. And so if you have a problem with vaccines that requires you to stop taking vaccines, you should stop dependably doing things you usually do. You should run around naked in thunderstorms. You should put raw meat on yourself and go swimming with shark-infested waters. All kinds of things become like, well, it's roughly as safe as not taking a vaccine. And so I think it really needs to be put to people how one-sided the debate really is, while at the same time very open-mindedly accepting their problems with vaccine science, and addressing every single claim. Dr. Mike Warshawski, the real Dr. Mike, had a great thing where he sat down with a bunch of vaccine and autism folks and it just debated them one-on-one. I think that kind of content is awesome. So I think that content producers on the pro-science side shouldn't be shy. Another thing is there was, some other media I've seen recently about someone who's a real nutritionist trying to, talk about what real nutrition looks like versus, bombastic claims by health influencers. And this real nutritionist, I won't say who he is, I think it was a great podcast of his I saw, is a very nice fellow and did a great job, except made almost no affirming claims that were high probability to be correct and thus stated concomitantly confidently. And thus I could have walked away with it if I didn't already know everything he was saying, which is my job to know. So I'm not the target demographic for that. I would have walked away from that podcast being like, this is a person who's very unsure and has functionally almost no advice to give us. And if you have no advice to give me, but the health influencer does, at least the health influencer has something for me. If I go to every restaurant and you say, don't eat there, don't eat there, don't eat there, and I turn to you and I go, where do I need to eat? You're like, well, I don't run a restaurant. I have no idea. I'm going to consider you substantially less helpful than otherwise. So I think when the evidence is very strong, we should couch it like that, say we could be wrong, say this is still our best, and then really pour down people's throats what that evidence really looks like and how clownish it can be to completely ignore that evidence or to go on a way tangent to other stuff that you are supporting that's very anti-evidence, but you have a lot of feelings about. And having a lot of feelings about stuff can be exposed by evidence-based people to not be a dependable way to reach good conclusions. So I think we can really be, as scientific thinkers, still probabilistic, still giving our best guess instead of certainties, but also giving our best guess with confidence of a best guess. Like, if you have to get to the beach versus the woods to get rescued by the helicopter, and you and your friends are stranded, and you see the beach and someone's like, we should go this way to the woods, you're like, I have a high probability estimate that the beach is right there because it's fucking right there. Look at it. And I could be wrong. It could be a mirage. I could be insane, but it's not like, well, I love your forest idea, and technically we could both be correct. Like, there's no time for that. But when we're in a survival situation, high probability estimates are good enough to really pour a lot of resources into. And when you're asking whether or not your child should be vaccinated, that is like, that level of importance, survival level of importance, you should probably be, as a scientist, okay with being like, yeah, vaccines are goated. They are undefeated. Everything has downsides. Their downsides are tiny and mostly misunderstood. Their upsides are, and you just start a slideshow of fucking polio, bro. Start the polio slideshow. Just hammered. If people want to use emotion with moms who have lost children, unfortunately, to what they assume are vaccine side effects. Sometimes they really are. You roll out the emotion stuff on our side. We don't need to be playing this game where we're always just monks and everyone else gets to use the full spectrum of hue and appeal. Roll out the smallpox shit, the crazy images of kids. A lot of times social media doesn't even let you show that shit. And you should be showing that because it's, guys, nobody is playing. You do not want to see your kid with smallpox. Sure shit don't want to see him with measles. This is what it looks like. You see this person who can't breathe anymore is 4 years old. That person's dying, and their parents are struggling, and they're weeping, and there's nothing to do about it because they missed the boat on the vaccine. That kind of stuff we need to say more often because that's the real shit. These people dying of measles and everything, they're not statistical aberrations. They're real human beings. Right. We hear about every single person who people want to speak up about vaccines and autism. Every single has a human face to them. This is my son, Jake, he's 11. He has autism because of a vaccine. Dope. That may very well be true. It's not. But it might, hey, listen, we're open-minded to it. But here are these other people who got screwed with vaccines. The real big problem is in the United States, we haven't had any evidence for the other side in a long time because we more or less kiboshed entire categories of diseases with proper community-based vaccination, by the way. So we just got to go to pictures of Pakistan and Africa and crazy-ass places, no offense, where like the vaccine still hasn't spread and there are people dying of diseases you never, ever want to see in your life. So we need more emotion dumped in with the expertise.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point. I think you're right. There's a sort of sense of, you have to keep a monk-like ability to stay above the foray. I think one of the challenges now is like we have failed to do exactly what you're sharing for so long that now you got a guy who has been captain of the Maha team, who has the most powerful position in all of public health in America, who's leveraging it in ways to continue to push the mis and disinformation. You spend a lot of time talking to folks who would be open to a lot of what he is pushing. And the thing about him is, we've talked about on this podcast so many times, is he often points to the right problems. He just has insane solutions because he's not girded to science to actually address them. How do you push back, or where do you think the conversation needs to go? Because the hard part about this is, you don't explicitly want to be political all the time. And at the same time, any effort to push back on what's happening, let's just say in this piece of this administration, will always be politicized. And so it puts us in a bit of a quandary. How do you think about RFK in this moment as somebody who is, has fealty to the science? And how do you recommend we talk about him in spaces where there is openness to what he's trying to push?
I think much of what you said applies. RFK seems to me like a person who's just really trying to do a good job to make America healthier, which I think we all agree with. And so I think it's awesome. And he has a lot of problems with all sorts of things that he thinks are causing bad health. Some of them really are. Some of them are not, or of a tiny, tiny fraction of the problem. And so we need to look at RFK and his Maha people, not as outsiders, but as teammates on Team America and Team World and Team Humanity, and be like, hey, fellas, like, we're not like, it's not him and his people, and we're looking from a third perspective. We walk over to his people and look at him from their ranks. Be like, oh, it's RFK. Cool. All right. What's he saying? Oh, he's saying all this good stuff, like dope. A lot of it's really great. And his why he's saying it is amazing. He just wants all of us to be healthy. What a great person. And so, like, let's take a look at like maybe what he's saying is actually like legit, seemingly according to science. And what he's saying is maybe not so legit, because I think all those people pretty much understand that like politicians can be wrong and often are egregiously wrong. So they'll never survive the critique of like, so you just like buy everything politicians say? They're like, well, hell no, I'm super skeptical. And they're like, but RFK is different. You're like, dope. He is pretty different. He's really cool. But let's take a look at all his claims and see if we can do any better. and see how, like, the what he says passes muster for like expert consensus and just like real world understanding, just real world gut check. Because a lot of what he says, gut check never passes, expert never passes, and people just kind of like, not everyone's an infinite knowledge. No one's an infinite knowledge machine. And so when he says various things, because he has good intentions and because they sound correct, they're like, yeah, sounds great to me. And where in fact, like, of course he has good intentions, but some of the stuff he says is just not true remotely, or is very, very far from the truth. Then it's up to us to very good naturedly say, hey, listen, I think this is wrong, but I love what he's trying to do, and let's discuss and see what actually happens in order to get the best path to the truth going without getting needlessly antagonistic and politically polarizing. Because the opposite end of the aisle on the left wing are some moderate fraction of why we're in a giant mistrust of science phase. They don't accept full responsibility for it. That would be crazy. But they do have a lot of problems that they made that gave birth to this administration and the way it's conducting itself in scientific matters. So I'd speak about that if you like, but that's not gonna.
I'd love to hear your take on that, please.
Yeah, super. So to me, there's like definitely a very complex landscape about why people don't want to hear from the trust the science crowd and from experts. The maha, I don't want to hear from experts. I want to hear from good natured Americans, people. It's super complex, but I think there are three major factors at play. One factor is that some of these folks are just like, their ideas don't match what science actually says. Like, they already have an idea that they're very attached to emotionally, that junk food is like really bad for your health in any dose, like it's a poison. And when you tell them, like, actually in moderation, junk food's totally fine, it's a little harmful, but it's teeny, and there's other variables that are way bigger, they just don't want to hear it. It does nothing to do with politics, has nothing to do with prior administrations, nothing to do with left or right wing. They're just full send, like, I want to believe this, and you tell them, this is probably not true, and they're like, nah, go to hell. And most of the experts are like, well, actually, yeah, it's not really true. They'll go to whoever who's not an expert to just agree with them. That's huge. That's probably the biggest one. Another one, a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle are just like not so into science and scientific and critical thinking, as true critical thinking is really annoying and doesn't really fit a lot of humans. Like, the hat doesn't fit that well. It can fit, but people just don't like putting it on. And so a lot of times when you're just not big into science to begin with, then people say, like, what about the experts? Well, the experts are only valuable if you consider expertise valuable, like epistemologically. If you don't, it just doesn't matter. And then it's just goes back to like, well, just like listen to everyone evenly. And there's just a whole lot more non-expert podcasters than there are expert podcast guests. And also almost everyone has ideas to begin with that might not match science, and then they just go to that. So I think that's a big part of the puzzle. And the last one is like, there is a little bit of politically motivated, politically caused expert distrust. And that's because for a long time, academia was, it still is, heavily left-wing biased in the way that is not objectively defensible on many issues. And what we got from the trust the experts consensus, quote unquote, was some combination of absolutely true scientific things, some combination of that, and I would say two other categories. One is things that the experts want you to believe are much more clear than they are, and in fact, they're really not. And the other one is things that are objectively false on every analysis you could ever run that was logical, but people are in the expert class are trying to tell us really are a thing. And I think that one really burned a lot of people out on expertise. A lot of that happened during COVID and stuff like that. So like, I mean, I literally remember when Trump rallies would get major publications about them during COVID because it was a hyperspreader event, which it probably was. And then at the same time, BLM rallies got, like, people said, because we had COVID and then the BLM thing started, the George Floyd stuff, and literal public health officials, major journal editors, like all the Twitter sphere, were like, nope, I support this cause. This is a great cause. People should be getting together to fight systemic racism, because systemic racism is even more dangerous than COVID. I mean, that whole thing I just said was just a giant pack of the most well-intentioned white guilt lies anyone's ever heard in their entire life. All of it was just batshit wrong, start to finish. And so if the expert class is like super like left-wingers, you can do no wrong. They look at right-wingers like, you guys are crazy and you're killing grandma because you're bringing COVID back in from your stupid Trump rally. It's going to catch a lot of right-wingers really, really wrong. And then when later you're like, hey, man, we all survived COVID. George Floyd shit died down. Everyone's cool. Do you guys want to listen to our advice on nutrition? They're like, fuck no, hell no. You guys lied to us in a big way. Another really quick one is the health at every size situation. still to this day, the American Medical Association, I know lots of doctors, I see their recurring continuing education stuff. They don't talk about calories, Abdul. They don't talk about body sizes. And when they do, they say calories are not a focus of dieting. Everyone's healthy at every body size. Never bring up weight with your patient. It's stigmatizing. They want health at every size because it makes Karens feel better about themselves. Straight up, there's just no other reason. And so politically, it's such a massive force that's burrowed its way through almost every formal health organization, like all the public health sector, the American Medical Association, and everything down the line. When you tell people that, honestly, you can be of any size and it doesn't matter and you can be healthy, but there's something especially toxic about white heteronormative masculinity, there you go. You made the Maha people the enemy. You told them the alternative was that every fat person is just as healthy as every not fat person, and that the real problems with health are something like structural or systemic inequity, which is all make believe to begin with. And then they just won't believe you because you've been wrong in two enormously major ways, and wrong in such a way that is obviously politically motivated. So then when you talk to them about vaccines, for which there is no political motivation, for which there is unanimous scientific one-way evidence that is these things are the god tier thing you should be taking and they're almost never to be avoided. But now you're coming from this perspective where at least about two major things in the last 5 years, you told them some shit that wasn't remotely true. And then, obviously the global warming stuff didn't help. I can talk about that at length if you like, but because academia has been so left-wing for so long, it started out in left-wing in the best sense of the word. And then it slowly went over to where the extremists took over, and it was left-wing to the point of we're saying stuff that's objectively wrong. But if you say anything about it, you get deplatformed. We just recovered from the deplatforming wave in 2021 or something like that. So now the Maha people feel really emboldened to rage against the machine, speak truth to power, because for so long the power was the extreme left, and the kind of ideas that were told by quote unquote experts were just blatant lies that everyone knew from their daily life was a blatant lie. And now you're trying to tell them, hey, but the vaccine stuff we were correct about. It's a tough road to sell expertise back to people to whom you use the expert class to lie to for political aims. Very good intentioned political aims, I might add, but nonetheless.
So I hear you on the point of there is a real and profound consequence to failing to show your work when you sieve down extremely complicated and complex questions into a right-wrong framework. And I think that, it kind of goes back to an earlier point that we were talking about, which is, a lot of times people from, public health officialdom or official public health feel the need to say this right, done, without saying, okay, I fully buy the possibility that we could be wrong on these things. And this is what that would look like, but here's where we are, here's what we know. And by the way, we've been right most of the time. I think, as you think about sort of the contraposition between George Floyd, for example, or MAGA rallies, functionally you have people who are coming together, and functionally the purpose for which they're coming together was either frowned upon or applauded by a lot of the majority of folks with platforms in the spaces that most people would occupy. And I think, what should have been said is, hey, look, there is still real risk whenever you have large groups of people coming together, whether they're coming together to a Trump rally or they're coming together for a mass protest. There's probably less risk if they're outside. So if the Trump rally is outside and the protest is outside, okay. But also systemic racism is a real thing, right? People feeling or being treated differently by government is a thing. And we need to address that when and if it shows up, in which case there is a public health value to this that is broader than the specific consequence of the virus. But I think you're right in the point that needs to be fully said, right? And I think when you tell people, oh, well, actually this is okay and this is not, when people are looking at it and saying but they're functionally the same thing, I get 100% where you're coming from. So I guess my follow-up on that, because I think you've raised some really good points, is do you feel like being able to step back and say, here's where the work wasn't shown and here's where it ought to have been shown? And yes, it is very difficult to disentangle, the collective goal of all of us being healthier from the collective goal of us having less racism in society. And we should have talked about that more explicitly. Do you think there's value in doing that, or because it feels like the news cycle just moves on and we go forward?
Talking about racism objectively is probably a non-starter in the foreseeable future for American politics. simply because objective discussions of racism brush up into things that are out of Overton window for both political parties.
I
So
agree with that.
racism is probably best treated as like a, hey, we all want good things for everyone. We all want equality and shit like that. Let's get to work on making that happen without going too far down the rabbit hole of cause and effect, blame, things like that. Very unproductive, because you end up like, so for example, telling white people they're guilty for all racism is preposterously stupid, because in part it's true, in part it's not true, and in almost full it's going to piss them off. And then telling black people that everything that ever happens to them is because of systemic racism is profoundly belittling, infantilizing, wildly ineffectual, countereffectual, actually. If you want to make people depend on government more and never aspire to anything, you tell them that there's nothing they can do about this grand thing in the sky. And so the whole thing ends up being like, well, if we're going to drill down to logical reality in this, we're going to go down a lot of rabbit holes that have to be gone down, that of shit that nobody wants to hear. Nobody wants to hear. Very few people want to hear, I'll say that way. So politically, that's a dead end. So what I'd say is really good focus is to try for public health officials and for other folks to only promote things that have consensus for objective good. Like, I don't care where you are politically. Vaccines are objectively a really great thing. Here's all the work for why that's the case. And have we been wrong before about stuff? Yes. Was some of that politically biased? Yes. Do we now have a very good reason to believe that vaccines, no matter what your politics are a good idea? Yes. And here's how. I think, there's possible to have conversations about coming to terms with the kind of bastardization of science from the left wing in the past several decades, sure, but I think only so many people are interested in that. Most of the people who'd want to convert don't believe you anyway that you've come to terms with this and you're going to do better. So just doing better is a real good idea, and saying, okay, from now on, anything we're going to tell the public as experts better be like our best guess at the truth, and better not have our stupid political stuff, which could be true political stuff. It could be valuable political stuff. It could be political stuff that like is really helpful for political stuff. But as soon as you tie political stuff into objective recommendations for health and fitness for folks, you're going to lose a whole bunch of them because they don't agree with your politics. I mean, like, try to, like Donald Trump comes on and says some crazy shit that's actually left wingers do agree with on the technical grounds. And he's like, it's my plan for America. Like, a lot of left wingers will just disagree because it's Trump and that's it. Like, so
There's
as
no doubt
long as
about
we
that.
just,
Yeah.
right. Like, so you just got to stick to true shit and say it's true for the following reasons, and then just go forward and do your best, but be very vigilant against further inceptions of the scientific communicative process by politically motivated bodies and narratives. That is a terrible idea, because you're just degrading trust left and right. It doesn't matter which side you come from either.
Yeah, I think what I find difficult about it, and see what you think about this, is that there are challenges where, what I'm hearing is we want to stick to consensus, right? And vaccines are a matter of consensus. There's just complete evidence on the individual level that they work, and they also work in a societal way, in which case there's an added value every single person who gets vaccinated. That is true, no question. It works at every scale of the conversation. Then there's questions about what you do about, for example, differences in infant mortality between Black and white families, right? And that one's a lot harder, because if you want to deal with that, it's really, really tough not to talk about racism. And so what happens is you end up not really focusing on those issues in which there is a profound difference in the experience of a particular thing, whether it's the health care system in which people are operating, the air people breathe, the communities that they live in. And I get your point about that's really tough because it forces you into a political territory. But I also worry that if you don't engage with it, then you leave some problems being less valued that affect some people more than others. And how would you recommend in the way that you think about it that we talk about this issue and the kinds of things that would, protect Black babies and Black moms more?
Yeah. So talking about racism is real tough. You better have some really good evidence that racism is occurring. The problem with systemic racism is there's almost no formal evidence for it, and about 1,000 contraindications and counterexamples. Systemic racism is like a ghost. You keep chasing it, you never quite find it. I'm very, very availed to the literature, and it's exactly what it's like. At the same time, We can't be, now we know that individual instances of racism do absolutely occur, and we have to reserve intellectual space for the fact that systemic racism could still be in the works, but is still so difficult to detect that we just can't detect it in any formal analysis that we run that's any good. And so we don't have to say, well, systemic racism isn't real. We can say, look, like systemic racism is not so dependable of a thing to say because every time people ask questions about it, it starts falling apart. However, what really is the problem is not racism. Racism is not a problem, has never been a problem. And I'm going to prove to you how. If you are incredibly courteous to me and incredibly kind, and we have total equity in services provided to us, and I live a phenomenal life, do I fundamentally care what you really think about me in the back of your head? If it's never, ever going to affect me in any way, and I mean that as a philosophically completely closed loop, no, you could have all sorts of bad ideas about people. It doesn't matter. Let's look at that from another perspective, because the racism itself has never actually hurt anyone. It's the what people do with it that hurts people. As public health people and as science communicators, we have to ask a question. How do we actually help black moms and black babies? You can publish a paper in the Annals of Anthropology or whatever till you're blue in the face about inequity and why racism is the real reason why there's inequity in the outcomes of black mother health and black baby health around the natal process. It doesn't help anything. I've actually never seen it help anything. There's no mechanism by which it can help anything. Can you imagine be like, all right, it's the racism. Okay, sweet. So we're going to go out in the world and we're going to do what? We're going to reduce racism. The fuck are we going to do that? You're going to talk to rednecks? You're going to tell them not to be racist? You're going to go talk to like just like hood ass black people that are up to no good, and you're going to tell them, hey, like you better act right because the white man could see you and it will reduce racism if you're on your best. Holy shit! How insulting is that to everyone involved? I don't know how the hell to reduce racism other than like a lot of kumbaya songs and good stuff. What I do know is that black women and black babies have worse outcomes than a lot of other statistical aggregates in the United States. So as a public health governing body, we have to ask the question of how do we help them the most? Like actually help, like provide them with services, provide them with information, try to figure out objectively affirmed root causes of those differences. Like that has nothing to do with racism whatsoever.
I think we generally agree on the, it's an interesting question. So I think there's an epistemological question and then there's a actionable question. The epistemological question is, if you can't tangibly touch an emergent phenomenon, is it not real? And I think the hard part is that what you're pointing to is that when you measure these differences, inevitably, it's like the differences themselves reify, right? They sort of step into as the causal mechanism of the thing that you're now measuring. And that's what gets really frustrating. I can see from a sort of like from a scientific standpoint, you're like, okay, so you're saying there are big structural differences and there are differences that are replicated across a number of different things. And the justification we have for them from a mechanistic action is the differences, right? And I can see how that's super frustrating. From a public health standpoint, you're right. Like targeting systemic racism is not a thing you can actively do so easily. You can target a number of different mechanistic pathway pieces, right? Pieces on the mechanistic pathway that allow you to say, okay, well, if we think that part of the problem is transit, we can offer transit. If we think that part of the problem is good food, we can offer good food. If we think part of the problem is the healthcare system, we can improve access to healthcare system. And I think you're right. Like those are all actionable items. I think the question then becomes, what is the role of naming a sort of emergent racism that happens at the level of institutions in trying to explain the process we keep seeing replicate across itself? And I think your argument to me is that if you can't actually target it, it doesn't really have a role. So what's the point? And all you end up doing is inflaming a bunch of people when you bring up the conversation anyway. And I think my point would be, well, I do think it's worth being able to say, even if you can't tangibly touch the thing, there is an overarching emergent phenomenon of the ways that organizations tend to get built or structures tend to get built as a function of like decisions made out of racism in history that continue to echo into society, right? So like segregation, for example, is a thing you can point to say people used to be super racist a while ago, didn't want to live in the same neighborhoods. There were some neighborhoods that some people couldn't buy houses in. And then over time, the people who are in these certain neighborhoods tend to be disproportionately a certain way, which tends to then differentiate the resources that people have access to as a function of the jobs that people used to have, et cetera. I don't think you disagree with me on that point. But the point that you're making is, yeah, Abdul, you can't fix that, right? So you should fix that in the short term. So you're saying you do disagree with me on that point.
I do disagree with that point. Absolutely. I think that the evidence for systemic and structural racism Some people even call it systematic because they have never differentiated the term systemic and systematic, are mostly boogeymen that fall apart upon deep experimental, rigorous examination. Some of them hold weight, but in very, very nuanced and couched ways. The other thing is, if you're willing to have a truly transparent conversation about the causes and effects of various inequities between the races, you can choose one of two paths. You can only talk about the politically approved ones like systemic racism, and that's totally fine. You'll lose most people because they'll know you're just like shooting guns with half an empty clip. You're not addressing the problem with full veracity. If you choose to address it fully, you're going to be unlocking wildly politically correct conversations that no one is going to be able to, not no one, most people would consider destabilizing at our current juncture in society, and our ability to hold traction on them. I can give you the not so politically correct one that's still considered toxic by most people. I'll abstain from the one that's clearly super politically correct. Is what is the difference in causal outcomes that can be attributed to systemic factors that are extra cultural? They don't intersect culture at all. And which ones are the ones that are cultural in nature? Like, cultures have different priorities. And so if your culture has a certain priority that doesn't align with health as much, and then you have poor health outcomes in that culture, how much of it is systemic mediated? How much of it is culturally mediated? Even those conversations are relatively toxic. So I've just previewed it, but I'm not so sure you want to have that.
No. I think actually, I think we're not disagreeing as much as you think we are. Nobody's saying that choices aren't shaped, right? That at the end of the day, some outcomes are a function of a choice. I'm just saying that a choice is a function of a choice set. And if you don't have a full choice set, at some point in your choices are minimal, right? So you have choice A and B, but not C and D. At some point, then the question becomes, well, how come some group of people doesn't choose C and D as often? Well, unfortunately, C and D is just not written on the paper as often as A and B are. And I'm just saying that, like, it's worth also asking, what is the choice set that somebody's actually negotiating when you start asking, well, how come certain choices tend to get made? And I'm just saying that, like, you know, in the context of a life course, right? If we all started at the same point, and at some point you end up having different outcomes, well, then that's a function mainly of unconstrained choices. But if you're starting at a different choice set as a function of just where you grew up, as a function of who your parents are, as a function of the school that you get to go to, which is itself a function of a whole bunch of different choices made well before you were ever alive, right? By you, by people related to you, but also by people not related to you who are, you know, we're expressing a certain level of racism against people who look like you, then at some point those choices are not as, you know, they're not as easy to ascribe to just what you chose to do. And so I think we're both saying the same thing, which is to say, in the end, it is very, very difficult to capture this thing called systematic racism and target that and say everything would be better, right? I think what we are saying is there are sets of public policy opportunities that we have to both influence a choice and also expand a choice set, right? And I think where we're differing is to say, my point, if you take the structural racism point seriously, is to say, maybe we should do as much as we can to address the choice set. And I think your point is to say, yes, Abdul, but also, like, you also have to be able to talk about choices that get made, right? And I think then, you know, some people would like to say, well, no, if the choice set is not the same, that you can't talk about choices. And I think some people would say, well, no, sorry, you have to talk about choices. And I think in the end, like, both groups are kind of right. You know what I mean? It's like these are problems that are by definition very, very difficult to get any set of inference around because they are mutually inclusive and pathways wind through each other.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I would say your choice set as an individual in any given position in America probably has a very tiny amount to do with historical, structural, systemic racism, and a huge amount to do with about a dozen other things. And so a continued emphasis on systemic racism is to assign the cause to a problem which probably shares a teeny fraction of the cause, and to usually ignore problems that are hugely, hugely imperative and hugely part of the cause. So it's weird to me to just isolate systemic racism unless it's for political reasons. Now, for political reasons, systemic racism works great. For practical reasons of improving people's public health, there are probably you're better off just avoiding that conversation altogether, not at all for the fact that it is politically incorrect or intractable. It just for the reason that there's like way more important stuff to emphasize, if you are really interested in maximizing people's public health and you understand that both public health sector and people's input ability to of information and change are constrained, because they are. Systemic racism is something that doesn't meet my top 10 or top 100 effectors of public health. So I just wouldn't know why we're talking about it. Now, as a curiosity in anthropological and sociological and political economy journals, yeah, systemic racism is worth a ton of discussion and has been getting it. But to put it as a very important factor of the health puzzle for any race of person in the United States is so why do you have that in there? And when you talk about it a lot, you do sure as shit alienate the Maha people like crazy, because they don't happen to be
Yeah.
that one race that you always talk
And
about.
I'll use an example here that might be, it'll be interesting because it gives us some something concrete to be attributing to. I would argue that systemic racism is on my top three, and I'll just share why. One of the programs that we built when I led Detroit's health department was a program to provide a pair of glasses to kids who otherwise wouldn't get one. These are kids who go to the poorest school district in America, or one of the poorest school districts in America, that itself was, went through a very difficult bankruptcy. And giving a kid a pair of glasses is a simple intervention that addresses a very concrete issue, which is kid has vision deficits, kid needs glasses to see the board. It is a game changer for those kids. Now, those kids don't get a pair of glasses but for the program too often, about 30% of the time. And you wonder, why don't these kids get that pair of glasses? And one could say, well, because there is not a value to get that kid a pair of glasses. But I don't think anybody really wants their kids not to have the glasses that they need to see the blackboard. I think there is a whole set of, okay, but let me finish the point. I think there are a whole set of different factors that lead to that issue that we all agree should be one that's easy to remedy and ought to be remedied every single time, right? And I think part of that operates through a different set of circumstances that shape access to the notion that getting good grades in school is actually a pathway into a better life. Because if you haven't seen it happen for you or people around you, that does not actually seem like a real thing, right? And so I just think that the tough part is, you could say, no, listen, absolutely, it is 100% parents' responsibility to get their kids a pair of glasses. And you could also say, actually, we can give them a pair of glasses for pretty cheap, and it's an intervention that offers this child a different pathway that they otherwise might not have had. And the fact that that kid is in a community, in a setting, in a place where you have had massive segregation over time that has shaped the quality of public schools, that has created a situation where you're going to school in classrooms that are overcrowded, where most of your teachers aren't, or many of your teachers might not have the means to be able to actually minister to the whole class, right? Oftentimes in a situation where the household is not one where that kind of attention can be paid. I agree with you. Not one of those things can be say, oh, that's where the systemic racism is. But collectively, right? Collectively, the fact that this happens more here and not here, right? 15 minutes up the street in Oakland County, where both you and I grew up, that's something that we ought to pay attention to. And I guess the question to me is that, how do you attribute that? Yes, you can sieve it out in a whole bunch of different intervention points, and we should intervene on those points. But asking collectively about why this happens here and not here, I think requires us to take a 30,000-foot view and also potentially say, well, there's just a systematic difference in the circumstances and the consequences of a set of decisions that were made well before. And I'm not saying that you blame all white people. That's not what I'm saying at all, right? I'm saying that there's just a difference that we probably need to address, and that may need to also be addressed at a 30,000-foot view as well. So would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say assuming that the effect of segregated schools persists into Detroit in 2025 would never survive any kind of empirical analysis. When's the last time that Detroit schools and Eastern Michigan schools were segregated in the formal de jure segregation approach? I mean, 4 generations or something? Can you try to prove that was systemic racism? You got a lot of impediments. Southfield has huge fractions of black people doing unbelievably well, and they got all the glasses they need. There's some reason they just ducked all the racism altogether somehow. So it starts to get real curious when you look at it from that perspective. There is another perspective that we're going to look at, and one of economic performance, economic productivity, forgetting race entirely. Some people are more conscientious than others. They plan for the future more, they scrimp and save, they take care of their own better, and some people are just less conscientious than others. And so a lot of times what you'll have is people whose kids don't have glasses are, through no fault of their own, simply unable to provide glasses for their children. That is exactly the kind of remedy that the political left is exceedingly over optimized to handle. That's a wonderful thing, because every child should have the ability to read and go to school. On the other hand, what fraction of those parents that can't provide glasses for their children have opportunities to do so but take other opportunities instead? For example, opportunities to engage in leisure activities, opportunities to not think ahead, to design a size of nuclear family that is manageable. And these are all cultural issues. They are all personal decision issues that, in my estimate, account for vast fractions of the reason why some kids in America don't have glasses and some kids do. The number of people in the modern United States that you can point to as being structurally poor, in a sense of there are things real average people are expected to be able to have, like books to go to school and glasses to read those books. The fraction of people with a mother and father at home, not 10 children to every 2 person, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children to every mother and father at home, whose parents are attempting in all good graciousness gainful employment and are still found in that structural poverty, is a fraction of a percent. It is very important to help every single one of those people. That is not remotely the predominant structure of the landscape. The vast majority of people who need glasses and their parents can't afford them, being that we know what the price index is, we know how much fast food work pays now, we know how much glasses cost, almost always, parents have very different priorities. For what reasons? Oh, well, there's a cornucopia of a discussion there. But assuming that structural and systemic racism, after all of these generations, still has an effect is, first of all, not in evidence. Second of all, most of the evidence is contrary to it. And then what we're left with good evidence for it, gives it an attribution of very, very small, unimportant attribution, a real attribution. The legacy of slavery and systemic oppression are still with us today. No debate. But they're teeny tiny in their total effects. And the more we keep lensing in on those is the more time we waste actually helping real people with real things in their lives from about 50 other vantages that are not structural and systemic racism related.
So, and I think, the degree of attribution, there's an epistemological question of how you attribute an emergent phenomenon that you can't capture and measure. So that I think we're differing on that point. I think the other place we're differing is on the degree of attribution to historical consequence, right? I think, I think you're an immigrant. I'm a child of immigrants, right? And there is this conversation I consistently have with folks in our own community, among immigrant parents, which is to say, I came here with $1 and a dream, and look what I built. I'm like, well, okay, but like also you came here with $1 and a dream and a PhD or a fellowship for a PhD. Right. And you came here as oftentimes la creme de la creme from the society from which you came. So you might not have had the same income, fair, but also, right, you had a whole lot of inherited value that you were able to bring with you to this place in what is ultimately an opportune place where you weren't hit with racism, or you might have been hit with racism, right? Like you might have, but you were able to build and grow. I think we take for granted, right, a lot of the consequence over time, right, of the inflicted disorder of racism, right, over time, and the notion that it's not like we live in a society where all racism has been abolished. That's not that. I don't think either you or I are saying that. I think where we do agree is that there are interventions to be had that are probably the same, whether or not you attribute to structural racism or you attribute to personal choice on the other extreme. Right? Is it that these interventions are things that you can actually intervene on? I don't think you disagree with the glasses program, right? I think you'd probably say that's a good thing to do. You should probably do it, right? And so, the question of attribution, I think, is interesting. I think where this gets really, really fascinating is how much are you willing to engage with answers to questions that have their basis in how much structural intervention government ought to be making in society. And I think that that's probably where you and I differ, right? It's like when you think about public health, yes, providing vaccines is something you and I would both agree on. I think you'd probably also agree on providing glasses. I think the question then becomes, well, how much is it an imperative for the public health infrastructure of our country to also make taking on the sequela of real or imagined structural racism, right, in addressing disparities that persist over time. And I think that's probably where you and I would differ. Am I characterizing that fairly?
Yeah, I would say that the academic left, which is kind of to say the academy in general over the past several decades, has had a degree of rigor in analyzing the problem of systemic racism that can be characterized as insanely and very well documentedly biased. And so any idea that most people have about the nature of systemic racism is probably going to be wrong, because we've been wrong on purpose, because there's been a massive echo chamber. And in order to try to be more correct about the various attributions of systemic racism requires us, because we've rolled out the red carpet for systemic racism being such a big deal, it's not as big of a deal as has been implied. We're going to have to roll back some of those ideas. That's very, very painful and can be taken very much the wrong way by just normal people that are like, well, they're saying racism isn't a thing now. I experienced it yesterday. Some guy called me the N-word. For real. It happened in real life. You're like, all right, well, it's not what we mean, but... And then you just end up being like, man, is this systemic racism stuff worth talking about? Because, systemic racism has some realities to it that are harsh for every single political party. So far, the political left has managed to talk about racism in a way that's very favorable to its nature of understanding the world. That is only half of the picture. Don't want to talk about the other half. I promise you don't want to talk about the other half. It's going to get people real riled up. So I think it's best to just leave racism the fuck alone for a while and help actual human beings of every race. And, like a great example of this is the public health factor of policing. The number one thing you could do for the Black community is to take the known roughly half of all criminals in the Black community that probably commit something like 80 to 90% of all repeat crime and put them away for a very long time. So we do not have very good rehabilitative practices. The science of rehabilitative criminology is saying that some of it works, mostly it doesn't. We know who commits the crime in most of these communities. We just need to put them away in jail with a brutal, in the best way possible, community police presence. 5x the police, not defund the police. There's almost no debate among criminologists about what brings down crime. Do you really care about Black people? I don't want Black people to be living in crime. It's fucked up. Why do they have to deal with it? Well, increase policing like crazy. Make sure it's body cammed and drone follow policing so the level of injustice drops to almost nothing. That would be amazing. I don't hear a whole lot of that from the left because, but a lot of white people have feelings about the police they can't quite articulate very well, but they know the police is bad somehow. So if you're looking at public health, even racism intersected efforts to do good, a lot of it has to do with like what goods and services, reading glasses, armed officers on the streets, actual help fixing public schools. How long has the left wing been in charge of Detroit government? For like, I don't know, 50 years? How come it's so terrible? Like, left wingers are supposed to have all the answers. I'm looking for a political left that really improves problems. I don't want to be shown anymore. The political left is New York, San Francisco with 80 trillion homeless people, Skid Row in LA, and then Detroit and Cleveland. That's a bad rap. And so if people want to be like believing the political left on the whole systemic racism thing, that you guys need to clean something up and show some really good results. And then, holy shit, you don't have to believe anything. I'll vote for a left-wing politician anytime.
What I'll say is, I think on the policing side, we'll disagree as a function of the fact that there are circumstances that tend to create criminality. I think the criminology literature is clear about that point too. I think your point about saying that policing, heavy policing can reduce criminality, like that is fair, except for there are a whole bunch of other externalities and consequences to doing that we as a society I don't think would like. I think we would rather be in a situation where we can address the root causes of criminality. And you'll argue that that has nothing to do with any sort of systemic racism. I think I'd argue that it does. There are things that determine the probability of somebody perpetrating a crime as a function of their circumstances. And I would say just because an intervention can be effective, right, doesn't mean that the consequences, the overwhelming consequences of that intervention should be justified, right? And then the question becomes: is there a more efficient, more equal way of being able to take on the issue? This has been a fantastic and fascinating conversation. I really, really appreciate you. I think where we can all agree is on the question of where and how we think about communicating science. And I think where I agree with you 100% is when we're talking about these issues, we've got to be just super transparent about what is known and what is not known. We've got to be honest about showing our work. And if and when there are broader ideological questions that cannot be demonstrated specifically, right, then we've got to be able to say, like, here's a perspective on how we're thinking about this issue. And I think had we done that, I think there might be a lot more trust. And then the other point that I think is really important is I think that the demonstrating the consequences of failing to follow basic science, I think, is also really, really important. And so I just really appreciate you joining us, Dr. Mike, on the show to chat this through. I think we followed it down an angle and a pathway that I hope to be able to continue with you sometime soon. But I really, really appreciate you joining the show. Our guest today is Dr. Mike Israetel. He is the personality behind RP Strength on YouTube. And certainly if you are fitness pilled like I am, you've seen his stuff. It's fantastic and it's always evidence driven. So really appreciate you joining us on the show today.
Dude, awesome. Thank you so much for having me on.